an event in the GA lobby called Breaking the Silence, Beating the Drum, which was sponsored by something called the World Harmony Foundation, of which David N.G. Lapsang was a sponsor. And this was a DPI event. I wanted to know, is this within the scope of the audit that you're looking at? There was also the Ark of Return Slavery Memorial, which was funded by Eng Lapsang in the indictment. So what I basically want to ask you for is a list. Some of these things don't need to wait for the audit.
Actually, I disagree. They would need to wait for the audit.
Okay, but
we'll
let
have
me-
to see what the audit does, and then we can
Okay.
provide the information.
There's
at that point.
video of Vijay Nambiar and Ban Ki-moon's spouse at the founding of the Global Sustainability Foundation of Sherry Yang, now indicted. So I don't think that Mr. Ban needs an audit to tell him that these two very close associates were there. So what does he think of their presence? Why were they there? And what's the response to them being there?
Again, we will wait for this audit to be conducted, and then we will evaluate at that point. Yes. Okay.
Sure. I want to ask about Yemen, DPKO, and Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka or you? Is it really about Sri Lanka?
Well, why don't we just wait and see, Because I thought actually people can ask questions in here.
Yeah, you're perfectly entitled to.
Okay.
It's just that you have this adorable way of saying what your subject titles are for your questions, and they seem to not match with that.
There was a protest in Jaffna. That's actually not what I was going to ask about. You could easily take a look at it, and I think it's outrageous you didn't answer it. But I have another Sri Lanka question. So my first question is on Yemen. Today, by video, Stephen O'Brien said, referring to the ship that was diverted by Saudi Arabia, that he was pleased to report that the food is now in Hodeidah, and pleased to report that the humanitarian IT equipment will be delivered to Aden on 6 March. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to know, is OCHA pleased that a warring party conducting an airstrike campaign on Yemen was able to delay humanitarian IT equipment for this long, and why is he pleased at that rather than angry at that?
You've heard what he said, and he means exactly what he said. He is pleased that this has now been cleared up. You'll have heard a few days ago, John Ging, the Director of Operations for the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, said that the idea that this equipment had been used for any other purpose has been disproven, and we're glad to know that through this procedure we were able to get the facts out, and that the equipment will now go to its intended use.
But will OCHA be equally pleased when other states block and delay their equipment? Like, is this actually a legitimate process for a country to divert humanitarian IT equipment and then be pleased that it's released on a delay, or is something more required?
I think, sarcasm aside, the fact is we're pleased that the matter is now resolved. It was a difficult matter, but it has been resolved.
Have there been threats to the WFP ships to leave Hodeidah quickly or face airstrikes? Question.
You are aware of what Mr. Ging said about the matter in just a few days ago, and I'll refer you back to what he said. We expect to have our humanitarian staff continue to go about their work, regardless of the cautions that have been received.
I want to ask you about DPKO. I've seen a story in which an unnamed UN peacekeeping official has, I guess, previewed what Mr. Kare is going to say on Friday. And he talks about possible court-martials and even DNA testing. And I guess first I wanted to ask, who was he? And the reason I ask is, if you're talking about name and shame, why would DPKO be presenting its information anonymously?
Matthew, the background briefings that are provided are background briefings. You know that we have background briefings. You've attended them, and I will abide by the rules of them.
Okay. Did Mr. Atul Kare conduct already on Wednesday of this week a sit-down interview with UN TV? And if so, when will it be released? And is this actually a publicity campaign to promote belated response to the rapes in the CAR? Or can we see the video now? Is it under embargo? I would like to know what the rules are of that.
Different UN officials do, in fact, talk to UN TV, and that's part of what we do in order to actually communicate the work of the United Nations. There's nothing untoward about that, and it'll air. And it will air at some point fairly soon, I believe. But ultimately, it becomes public when it does. You'll be able to see it on the website as anyone else.
Okay,
yes.
here's a Sri Lanka question. You seem to have tried to stop in advance, but there's a letter from the.
Stopping in advance.
I
just don't like false advertising.
If the UN is protested in Sri Lanka, I think it is a Sri Lanka question. I actually think that you do answer about protests of the UN elsewhere. So,
sure.
And in fact,
so
if Vice News
is this a protest having to do with Sri Lanka, or is it about you?
if Vice News asks you about Turkey locking up Vice News journalists in Turkey, do you say, don't ask about Vice News? I'm just asking you. So if the UN does something that people protest, you don't answer? But here's my question. There's a letter from a group called the Tamil Relief Fund, and it is saying the following. It is saying that not 40,000, as reported in Mr. Band's report, but 70,000 civilians were killed in 2009, and it says that the UN has not conducted any credible investigation in it, and that therefore a number of parties, including the UN, should not invest with the government, which has committed, they say, a genocide. And I'd like to know, the UN side of this letter, how do you respond? Does the UN feel that it conducted an inquiry, a sufficient inquiry, into the number of people killed, and that there's been accountability, and how does the UN justify its now more accommodative stance given the facts alleged in this letter?
Well, you'll have seen what we've been saying about the Sirisena government and its efforts to investigate. We're trying to encourage an effort to get to the bottom of what happened in the end of the conflict with the Tamils. And we want to make sure that there's an actual good faith effort by the government of Sri Lanka to do that, and we'll keep pressing on that.
According to the UN, how many people were
Hold on.
killed?
Yeah. Yes.
Just a housekeeping question. Are there transcripts available of press conferences in oh, sorry.
Yeah, please
Um,
use that.
Thanks, just housekeeping questions. Are there transcripts available of press conference in Geneva, like Jan Eglin this morning, and do I have to listen to it live again?
Yeah, the press conference that they have, the UN office in Geneva transcribes those, so hopefully they'll be out on their website later.
Thanks.
Yes.
According to the UN, after all this time and all this interest, according to the UN, what approximately, as close as you can make it, was the approximate number of civilians killed in 2008 and 9? And also, has the matter of Mr. Vijay Nambiar, close senior advisor of Ban Ki-moon, and his role in communicating with surrendering individuals at the end of the conflict who ended up being killed with a white flag in their hands, has this matter been resolved within the UN system to the satisfaction of Ban Ki-moon? Because it's not to the satisfaction of people in Jaffna.
We've already said where we stand on the question of how Mr. Nambiar handled that. I'd refer you back to what we said several years back regarding the death tolls. Ultimately, that's the figures had been developed and are in the hands of, I believe, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So you should ask them. All right. Have a good afternoon. See, that was natural. No,
You should see what the sign said. The sign mentioned Vijay Nambiar. Please look at the photograph. Please.
Yeah, I mean,
So when there's a protest, you should just answer. I'm not trying to, I'm just saying, like, no question is out of bounds. Let somebody ask.